Thank you. You know the name of the book, it's Audacious Hope. I was thinking, we just said goodbye to the 17th Lok Sabha. PRS legislature and various other sites that monitor these things produce some statistics that are interesting. One, since 1952, when we had the first Lok Sabha, to now, in terms of working days, this is the least productive Lok Sabha there has ever been. Two, 146 MPs were suspended during the course of this Lok Sabha. Three, for the first time ever, the Prime Minister did not respond to a single question. This much? Good? Thank you. I should learn how singers do this. Moving on. The entire Lok Sabha passed without a deputy speaker. Why not? Because by convention, the deputy speaker is drawn from the ranks of the opposition, and the government did not want to give the opposition a chance. In the Rajya Sabha, where the BJP does not have a majority, not a single question filed by the opposition was taken up for discussion. In the Lok Sabha, over 300 questions sent in by opposition members were not responded to and have actually been deleted from the records. So there's all of that. What's happening with the courts, we know. The armed forces have pretty much become props for photo ops. What is happening with the cops, we know. Professor, I was thinking, given that every single institution of democracy seems to be eroding, and rapidly at that, there's a considerable degree of audacity in even writing this book.
Thank you for noting that.
Yeah, so I'm curious, why did you even think of writing this book?
Good question. Thank you so much for leading with it, and thank you to everyone who's come over this evening. I really appreciate it. I think your question sort of gets us to think about what a democracy is. And we are often used to thinking about democracy as about regular elections, as about free and fair elections, as about checks and balances between institutions. And of course, you're right, it is all of this. But in all of these discussions on democracy, we often forget that democracy is about the people. It's about what people do in order to hold their governments accountable. It's about what people do when they feel that the government is acting in a way that is not consonant with their views. It's about protesting when they feel that the government is being unjust. It's about the right to disagree. It's about the right to dissent. And I think because of all the usual ways of understanding democracy, and you're absolutely right, of course, that the institutions seem to be failing democracy. But we've seen that people have risen to the occasion, demanding that, well, things be done in a way that is in consonance with the law. They've protested unjust laws when it's come to that. You've seen students demanding and pushing ideas for social change. And I think it's extremely important to note and to appreciate and to recognize what people themselves are doing. The audacity of hope lies in the fact that ordinary people are doing this despite the institutions not being supportive of them. And I think you're quite right in picking up the ways in which the institutions might be failing people, but the people aren't failing themselves, if that makes sense. And there's an idea of what democracy is. There's an idea of what the government should be doing, which seems to animate a lot of the individuals that you will meet in this book. So that's where the audaciousness of hope comes in.
And the audaciousness of the book, yeah. In some, you would say that if the institutions are failing, demos is not.
Absolutely. Back in the 1970s, I think, or 60s, it was Lohia who had said, when the parliaments sleep, the streets have to come alive.
Yes.
And in some ways, you're seeing pretty much that going on.
We will get into the crux of the book in a bit, Professor, but before that, I wanted to ask you, I was looking up some of these numbers, regimes of the world, for instance, which monitors the quality of governance in countries around the world, the lexical index, the Economist's intelligence units report. One of the points they make is that as of 2016 was probably the high watermark of democracy. If you go by numbers, the point all of them make is that in 2016, there were 96 functioning democracies in the world. Some partial, some full, whatever, but 96 was the number. By 2022, that had dropped by 6, it's 90. And there has been subsequent erosion, which hasn't yet reflected in the reports. I was also startled by the fact that the number of people who, again, according to all these bodies, whose democratic rights have been removed or eroded has actually risen to 3.9 billion, and that includes the population of India, it includes the population of Venezuela, it includes the population of Turkey. And we know why, all of those places. The other startling number is we say that there are 90 democracies. Forget about the 6 that lapsed. The startling number is that 3% alone live in what are full liberal democracies. 37% live in partial democracies. India falls into that. Another 37% live in autocracies, authoritarian regimes. Professor, this political theorists suggest that this thing is cyclical, that a period of liberal rule is almost inevitably followed by a period of authoritarianism. Is there something to that? And I mean, have you in your researches?
Yeah, so political scientists are a very divided lot, usually in the best of times. When it comes to the question you're posing, they're almost at each other's throats. So, of course, there are some political theorists who talk about cyclical nature of these things, almost as if, it's a sort of law of physics. But politics doesn't quite operate as a law of physics. So I think we have to recognize human agency. We have to recognize the will of the politicians themselves. We have to recognize the will of different social groups, political leaders, etc. So there are several explanations that have been given to why democracies have been facing a steady erosion, not only among the countries that you mentioned, but even among liberal democracies, or the so-called liberal democracies, like the United States, if you think of that as a liberal democracy, but even Britain and other sort of the North European countries.
Actually, the US has been moved out of liberty.
I can imagine why, absolutely. But I fear that the US moves back to being a liberal democracy just because Biden is back to power, and I think there's a problem there. Anyway, but staying with your question, so some scholars have suggested that the world became too liberal and that there's a cultural backlash. And that cultural backlash is led by usually religious or ethnic majorities, or by people who feel that their traditional ways of life are being threatened. Whether that's real or not is a different question, but there's a perception that people's traditional ways of life are being threatened. Others have suggested that democracy went hand in hand with economic inequality. Whether we like it or not, the last 30 years or so, although they saw a rise in the number of democracies, the world also saw enormous inequalities and rising inequalities. And so the argument there is that people who were losing out economically were sort of lurching right, or taking recourse to strongman politicians, or to political parties that promised them the world, that promised to redistribute. But we have to recognize that the world is a very diverse place, of course, and different countries have different dynamics, so to speak. So a lot of these theories may work in Western Europe or North America, but in India, if you look at the ways in which people vote the voting patterns across different groups, we find that it's not the losers of economic reforms who support the right, it's the winners. And I suspect that's because of such things as, and I've documented that in the book, ideas of equality, ideas of affirmative action, ideas of extending social welfare, which is something that some elite groups may not agree with very much. So when explaining the democratic erosion in India, lots of scholars have suggested that it's not the poorest groups or the losers of economic liberalization, it's actually the winners. And if you look at economic growth rates, it's very interesting because world over, when you have populist leaders elected, they usually come in after a period of economic slump. There's an actual economic sort of downside. In India, on the eve of the 2014 elections, India was actually doing very well economically compared to other parts of the world. It's just that growth had slowed down. It hadn't plummeted, it had slowed down. There's, of course, a great deal of inequality, but it looks like those at the top of the socio-economic hierarchy were still threatened by the demands of Dalit groups or other backward classes or the rural and urban poor, and were sort of looking at a political party that they might sort of feel more comfortable with. So the reasons differ from country to country because the world is such a diverse place, and I think the Indian context therefore has to be recognized as such. What works in India doesn't work in, say, a place like Turkey, where we know that it's the poorest groups who tend to vote right. But like in Brazil, so in India, it is the richer groups who've tended to vote right rather than the poorer groups. So I think there's that element of understanding social relations and relations between different classes that would help us. We shouldn't look for one explanation across the world because there isn't one. Some of my Marxist colleagues would like us to believe that there is one. Some of my cultural sort of explanations colleagues would like us to believe there is one. There isn't, unfortunately, one explanation we can plug everything onto. So,
Professor Roy was actually pointing the finger at all of us. We are responsible.
Some of you, not all of you. Not all of you, as they say.
Professor, I just wanted to stay with that thought for a minute because in your chapter, Erosion of Democracy, there are 2 points you make, and you kind of glancingly made that just now. I'd love for you to elaborate. The first point that you make is when you say that the reasons for the crisis in democracies is their inability to deliver basic services to those who need them the most. You're basically talking roti, kapda, makan, maybe a bit of education and employment along with it. The other point you make, you say a related reason is the inability of democracies to resolve the fundamental imbalance ingrained in capitalism, that the world is richer than ever before, but fewer people share that wealth. And that is there. 1% owns about, 40% of all the wealth. 50% own 3% of all the wealth in this country, according to the latest. One thing that I don't get, though, in the run-up to the 2014 election, I remember multiple surveys, which pretty much all of them, when they were asked the big fault lines or the big issues that they were facing, they all said economic growth, which is the point that you made. Subsequently, in the last 10 years, it's not like economic growth has happened. There is a case to be made for arguing that it has declined, but we leave that aside. The same situation prevails, more or less. But that does not any longer seem to animate us. If you look at the results of the 2019 election, for instance, or if you look at the results of the various state elections in some of the poorest of the states, how does that happen? Why do we, another way of putting that question would be, why are we voting successively against our own self-interest?
Yeah. Again, that's an excellent question because we then have to think about what self-interest is and how we define self-interest. Often self-interest is thought of only in economic, material terms, but there are also symbolic interests, if you will. I might be quite happy to barter away, if you will, my economic interest if I feel that my cultural interests are being safeguarded, or my symbolic interests are being safeguarded. You know, there's a pursuit of a higher, common, greater sort of good, which I feel is, you know, which according to me is what everyone else should also think like. So in a way, when we talk about self-interest, and it's a really important point you raise, we tend to think of self-interest in very economic, rational terms. But religion matters, and it's not just about religion mattering in India. We know religion matters elsewhere in the world, including in the West. Culture matters. Our perceived social position matters. And I think there's something to be said there, where we feel that we are under threat or our dominant position is under threat, whereas in fact it might not be. But of course, that's, for example, yes, Hindu khatre mein hai, or, you know, white people are in danger, or Islam in danger, if you take the Turkish context. I mean, it sort of works across, you know, depending on who's the majority and who's not. So I think when we talk about self-interest, we need to recognize that these aren't objectively measurable economic indicators. There's a great deal of A, perception, but B, non-economic interests, such as symbolic interests, such as cultural interests, religion being one sort of idea, social hierarchy being another. So, you know, when all of those are in threat, real or otherwise, then you're going to see these sorts of movements, the sorts of sort of trend towards voting in right-wing political parties. Now, we have to be careful that when we talk about the threat to democracy, it doesn't only come from the right. The threat to democracy also comes from the left. And that, of course, has a very different set of dynamics, which is much more closely linked to what you said in terms of when you have economic inequalities, when you have economic disparities, those who have lost out would sort of support more left-wing, dictatorial, populist parties. We don't have that worry here in India, not for the moment at least. So I'll leave that out of the discussion. But if there was ever that came into being, then, you know, you can sort of look at other reasons.
I still sort of in the early phase of the book where you're setting the scene for what is to follow, you talk about a seminal moment when everything flipped. That was August 5, 2020. Anybody remember what that was? No. August 5, 2020, the Prime Minister of India laid the foundation, the Bhumi Pujan for the Ayodhya temple. Professor, what you wrote is, from that moment on, from here on, India's democracy, nominally secular, not because it enforced a strict separation between religion and the state, but because it maintained an equidistance between the state and the country's numerous faiths, could be seen as firmly distancing itself from its liberal and pluralistic roots in favor of a more explicitly ethnic orientation. That's a quote from your book. I'd like you to elaborate on that, but I am also curious about why you picked August 5, 2020. Why not, for instance, Advani's Rath Yatra? Why do I keep talking about Adani?
Who knows?
It's all over the bloody place. So. But Adani's Rath Yatra, for instance, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, for instance, would they not be of the same significance, or probably more, because as inciting incidents?
Thank you. Again, I think that's, and thank you for the close reading of the book, but I was tempted to sort of look at dates in the 1990s, especially the one you're saying. But I think there's a very crucial difference. What happened on 6 December 1992 was by a largely oppositional, well, you know, non-government sort of group. Yes, they were a political opposition, and yes, the BJP ruled Uttar Pradesh, but, you know, even Kalyan Singh was extremely apologetic, took moral responsibility for what, of course, we all know, you know, they were all hand in glove, perhaps you could say, but he took moral responsibility. And as the head of the state in Uttar Pradesh, he stepped down. What happened on August 5th, 2020 was the Prime Minister of a nominally secular country, you know, being explicitly associated with the religious acts of a single community. Now, let's be clear. I'm not thinking here of secularism as the sharp distinction between church and state as you find in France or other Western European countries. I think that debate in the Indian context was settled long ago. Secularism in India is about dharma nirpekshata, or it's the state being equidistant from all religions. So in that sense, you've had heads of government who have sort of participated in religious activities of all religious communities. Now, I'd be quite happy to sort of take my words back, and if there's a second sort of edition or subsequent editions, to retract on this, if the Prime Minister were to extend the same courtesy to places of worship of other religious communities. For instance, when the Babri Masjid or the new masjid that is being sort of, built at the outskirts of Ayodhya, if he is invited to do whatever it is that they do to mosques to make them a holy place, then, and if he turns up for that, that would be in the spirit of a secular sort of democracy. We all know, we don't know whether he will or not, but it's safe to assume, given what we do know is that he actively presided over the proceedings in a temple, and knowing the history of the temple, it was very clear what was at stake. Which is why I think August 5th, 2020, rather than 6 December 1992, is a much more important moment, because here you have the head of the government presiding over the ceremonies that he did, whereas what happened in 6 December was, and I'm not saying this to sort of minimize the enormity of what happened, but they were, after all, an oppositional group. They were not in power, and even those elements who were in power took moral responsibility and stepped down from their position.
So that would involve a lot of ifs and buts. If Modi remains the Prime Minister, if the Babri Masjid is repositioned, and if the Prime Minister is, yeah, right. Another point you make in your, not in the introductory chapter, but in the first chapter, Professor, is you give Modi and the BJP credit for accepting electoral results even when it has gone against them. I read that and I wasn't quite, how do I put this? I wasn't quite convinced, because accepting an electoral result, yeah, the numbers are declared, you accept it, but then you start, I mean, it's almost militaristic, right? You name them Operation Lotus, Operation this, Operation that, and the point is to subvert the results of the election. The way I look at it, when I vote for a person, I'm not voting for that person so much as I'm voting for an ideology that that person ostensibly represents. So if I'm voting for the BJP, I'm saying, yeah, I'm voting for whatever, Hindutva and Common Civil Code and all of that. If I'm voting for one of the opposition parties, I'm looking at more liberalism, a focus on the economy, a focus on societal development, all of that. Now, I vote for this person for these reasons, and then whether it is induced or whether it is bribed or bought or whatever, he changes sides. It seems to me that the essence of democracy is subverted. So when you say that Modi represents or Modi respects electoral results, how do you justify that?
Again, thank you. That's a tricky one, I have to say. But I would stick to the claim I make that whatever the other faults of the present dispensation in terms of safeguarding democracy, at least in terms of formally, officially respecting the verdict of state elections, they've had no option but to officially at least recognize that they are not in power. And I did this very interesting exercise when I compared the extent to which the BJP dominates the Vidhan Sabhas across India with the extent to which the Congress party used to dominate the Vidhan Sabhas under Nehru up till 1967. And back then, you saw total sort of Congress dominance across the land, with the exception of Kashmir in the north and Kerala, of course, famously. And we know what happened to both Kashmir and Kerala. Mr. Modi has to be more careful. He's not, to my mind, yet sort of, dismissed state governments in the way that used to be done in the past, but he's had to take the sorts of approaches that you mentioned. which suggests that he's got to be more careful and more manipulative, perhaps, to use your terms, but he cannot do what used to be done in the past. And I think there's something to be said about having to respect, not because he may be personally very inclined to respecting the verdicts. We have no idea, we have no way of finding out what's going on inside his head. But what we do know is that, he's not openly defying the election results. He's had to take recourse to these sorts of actions that you say, and that's, of course, you're right. That's not what you expect in a democracy. That goes against the essence of a democracy. But in a formal sense, at least, in an official sense, he has to respect democracy. And I think herein lies the dilemma, the problem, that a lot of the people who are protesting or who are dissenting from the government have to face, and which is why the odds are so stacked up against them. Not only are they facing a difficult situation, but the situation is such that it's quite easy for it to be considered a democracy. If you tell an observer, an observer from outside that, well, Mr. Modi's, not dominating the country in terms of the state elections, the Vidhan Sabha elections, they will, of course, look at the map and say, yes, that's true. So in a sense, the fig leaf of democracy is quite sort of nicely, continues, and that makes it even more difficult for people to really protest, because I've been asked this question: what erosion of democracy? Where is the erosion of democracy? Mr. Modi is as democratic, if not more democratic, than Nehru and Mrs. Gandhi, because he has not suspended the parliament, or he's not suspended democracy formally. He's respecting the verdicts of different electoral sort of outcomes in the states. And you have to give it to them that they've played their cards well, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Realpolitik. And one of the things I notice or read between the lines of both the book and the professor's answer just now is Trump has set such a low bar that, almost anything beyond that. Yeah. Professor, when you start talking about fault lines, fissures, and protests, you start with the question of caste. You begin with 1981, Meenakshipuram, where the Pallar community finally had enough of being oppressed and en masse converted to Islam. 3.5 years later comes Kashiram, who starts the Bahujan Samaj Party, again as a sort of protest come direct action against what the caste, what the backward caste was suffering from. From there you do touch on Madhav Singh Solanki using the alliance of the Kshatriyas, the Muslims, the Adivasis and the Harijans. You move from there to, that would be VP Singh's Mandal implementation. And finally to 2023 and the Bihar caste census. Now all of these measures were intended to, how do I put this, ameliorate the plight of the backward classes. This is the first real chapter where you start talking about hope. I was looking at the NCRB statistics, and for the 7th year in succession, the incidence of crimes against the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes has actually gone up. In the case of the latter, it's by a whopping 6.4%. Professor, where in this do we find hope? Where do we locate hope?
Excellent. Thank you again. I think there's always the dilemma in terms of thinking about hope when you're faced with such difficult structural, political, institutional sort of constraints. I think the experts who worked with the data, the NCRB data, the National Crime Records Bureau data, which measures atrocities against the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, from which you were quoting, they say that one of the not the indicators, one of the elements of this data that we have to respect and recognize is that the data is only recorded when people come forward and say that there has been an atrocity on them. And the idea of defining what an atrocity is, the idea of putting forward and going to the police and saying that so and so has behaved with me in a certain way, or I have faced discrimination on account of my caste, itself requires you to think about what it means to lead a dignified life, what it means to be considered as an equal. And the fact that people are not being considered equals, is very different from what you see earlier. Now, strictly speaking, we are not able to compare the situation with the pre-1989 period because such data wasn't, sort of collected then. But I think if you see a rise in the number of cases, experts who work with these data point to two things. One, a greater self-awareness. If I'm Dalit and somebody has behaved in a way that is not in keeping with my constitutional rights, I now have a sense of my constitutional rights being violated and going and reporting that. And so, of course, there's a clear case of hope. I hope that the state or the police will take action. I wouldn't just go just because because going to a police station for these social groups that you mentioned requires giving up a whole day's, if not more, labor. It means going to the police and actively sort of filing an FIR against somebody who's likely to be locally at least more powerful than them. So these are conscious choices that people make or take when they go and sort of file these cases. So there is the hope that something will come of it. There is the hope that I'm not going to just let what has happened to me happen and keep quiet about it. Of course, a lot of that happens, but those who have gone and reported these cases have a hope that the police will act on them, that something will be done of them. Otherwise, why would they do it? Why would they go? The second reason that experts often say that the cases might be going up or are going up is the fact that Dalit groups or Adivasi groups no longer acquires in sort of lying low as they may have in the past. They are not only recognizing their rights, but they're also actively claiming those rights, which may annoy a lot of the elite groups.
This would be the Great Chamar kind of example.
For example, they are doing things which, assert their equality with others, and that annoys people who might then sort of be violent, and that sort of, takes us back to the first sort of point that I made. Then, because the dominant groups are violent, and the Dalit and Adivasi groups know their rights, they will go right on to putting the cases. So, in a way, I would say this is a classic example of hope, the rise in the number of cases, albeit a little paradoxical, because of course you see a rise in violence. But we have to be careful that hope is not utopia. Utopia is when you have a perfect world where everything is sort of taken care of. But hope is, by its very nature, it is incomplete. It is sort of a work in progress. And it involves a great deal of back and forth, a great deal of navigation and negotiation. It's not about deliverance by the divine. Mm-hmm. It's about an active working here and now, and working with whatever you have, whatever materials you have, not expecting a revolution tomorrow, either of the Marxist or the religious variety.
So for my own personal Cliff Notes version of this, Professor, would it be fair to say that even looking at the time before independence and then all the way through the 60s, the 70s, maybe even the early 80s, where the repressed classes, which I'm using a broad umbrella term for all of this, where they looked at these quotidian happenings as part of life, this is how it is. Today there is a greater sense of self-worth, and therefore a greater awareness that they need to stand up and speak out, and that they're willing now to wear their identities on their sleeves, in a sense, which is why I brought up the Great Chamar that you refer to, where they actually put up banners.
So I think the Great Chamar incident that you mentioned is really exemplary of what I'm suggesting. These are not protests against this or that. This is an active assertion of people's being. I am of community X, and just as you or you or you could sort of, take pride in your identity, I'm not going to tell you not to take pride in yours, but I'm going to take pride in my own. And that, in some ways, is very different from the protest movements that we see in the past. Now, let's be clear. Protests have been part of the social landscape in this land, in this country, for centuries. Whether you have Buddhism versus Brahmanism, whether you have the Bhakti movements, which a lot of people have said are about protests, or you have had anti-colonial protests more recently. Protests are a part of the landscape of this country. But what you see in through the examples that you mentioned is not a protest against X or Y. It is about simply saying, this is who I am. And I think you mentioned somewhere about, wearing your identity on your sleeve. And in some ways, yes, it is that. It is about saying, well, I am many things. Of course, I'm Indian, I'm X, I'm, Y, I'm a student, blah, blah, but I'm also of this community. And why not in a country where community matters so much? This is who I am. There was offense taken to the term Great Chamar because others said you can call yourselves whatever without the word great. And they said, well, if you can call yourself the Great X or the Great Y, why should we not do that? So it's really an assertion of equality. It's nothing more, nothing less. And some people would say that's a protest, but I don't think the people themselves were thinking of it as a protest. In a sense, it's just who I am. I exist. And if that is a problem for you, then
that's your problem.
It's your problem, not mine.
Right. Which naturally segues into the second big point that you raise, which is about the emergence of the students as one of the stormtroopers for, or stormtroopers may not be the right word, so can we edit that out? Let's say in the forefront of protests against what they perceive as injustice, and this goes all the way back to, you could go back in time because I was a student leader during the emergency, I know what happened then, but more contemporarily, you had the Rohit Vemula incident, then you had the JNU protests revolving around, whatever the reason was, the Kanaya Kumar arrest. Umar Khalid, by the way, is still in jail. After that, you had the anti-CAA protests. You had the students stepping up for pretty much everything. Even the farmers' protests, they have been demonstrations, protests, placards, all of that. One of the things that in relatively recent times, that I keep hearing whenever this sort of thing happens, Professor, is it's not the business of the students to take to the street. The students are supposed to study. The parents have spent a lot of money. The government is spending a lot of money on you. What the hell are you doing? All of this. The fact that the students are coming out onto the streets, not because their canteen bill went up, but because an act which they deem iniquitous has been passed in Parliament, is one of the central points where you locate hope in this book. Could you elaborate?
Thank you. Yes. I think you're absolutely right. A criticism often of students involving themselves in politics or being outside the classroom is that they're not doing what they should be, which is studying. But of course, that ignores a very crucial element of education. Education is not only about completing the syllabus, it's also about being a good citizen. It's also about being a member of the political community. And this is something that has been recognized, over decades in India, abroad, elsewhere. And of course, you've yourself been a student leader, but many of the politicians that we have today, whether on the left or the right, have been student leaders themselves. So it's a bit rich for them to say, either irrespective of the political spectrum, to say that students should just do what they should be, what we are expecting them to do. And I suppose in that sense, the students teach us a great deal about citizenship. Citizenship is not only about, standing up when you are directly affected. Of course, it is that. But it's also about taking a stand when other people are affected. It is about a term that I keep using in this book. It's about demonstrating solidarity with other causes. Some people would say they're being busybodies. They are sort of interfering in everything but what they should be doing. But of course, this is what a citizen should do. A citizen, and a citizen of a country is a citizen not only because they have a passport or they have the Aadhaar card or whatever. They are citizens because citizenship is about a political community. It's about taking care of one another. It's about being there for others. It's about demonstrating the sort of solidarity that, the students have been at the forefront of. So whether it is the students who came out in protest after Rohit Vemula's suicide, whether it's all those students who came out when the JNU incident was sort of playing out, or in the book you will also meet with people in places like Allahabad University or in Manipur University, where they were far away from the media limelight. They were doing things that you would expect of citizens, which is to stand up against injustice, which is to stand up and protest when they believe that the institutions are not doing what they should do. And it is extremely unfair to expect students to just sort of sit in their rooms and study. I can see where that is coming from, because as a parent myself of a university-going student, who has to pay a great deal, I would much rather that my daughter sit in university and sort of do what I am or my partner is paying for. But that's not how these things work, and that's not how they should work, because whether you're an office goer or a homemaker or a student or a farmer, you're also a citizen of this country, and as citizens we owe a great deal to each other. It's not only about going and casting your vote or ensuring that your Aadhaar card is ready. Those are important things, by the way. I'm not suggesting they're not. It's just that there's much more to citizenship than just going and casting your vote. And I think there's a great deal we learn from the students when they stand up and go out onto the streets or they're outside the classrooms demanding and protesting the way they do. They're not just citizens of tomorrow, they are citizens here and now, and we need to respect that.
I've been here before for book events, and one of the things I know about the Bangalore audience and the BIC audience is they're a very engaged lot with a lot to say for themselves. So I want to turn it over to the audience as fast as possible. But before that, Professor, I just wanted to link a couple of chapters from your book. After the students, you talk about the CAA protests, and then you talk about the farmers' protests. Now, in your earlier answer about the students, you talked about the responsibility of the citizen, not merely to herself, but also to others. One of the commonalities that I found in the CAA protest, which I happened to cover, and the farmers' protest where I hung around on the fringes the last time this happened, was that there was that sense of solidarity. The farmers turned up for the CAA protests, the students, the general community at large is now backing the farmers' protest. There is a lot of, and while there is, again, if you go strictly by the media, this is restricted to Khalistanis from Punjab and a bunch of no-hopers from Haryana, but that's not the fact. On the day one of the protests, if you remember, farmers were arrested from Andhra Pradesh as they were trying to go, farmers from Kerala were going Tamil Nadu, all of that. So all of this, again, are the places where you locate hope. How does this translate? So at some point it has to translate into some kind of transformative change. Do you see that happening? Because your last chapter says, how do you save a democracy? So I want to link all this up together and ask you whether in this, the million mutinies now that have been sort of escalating over time, do you see that hope? And if so, could you draw us a roadmap?
Yeah, that's always a challenge. I'm not going to fall for that trap. But what I will try and do is to sort of pick on some of the elements that you've mentioned and, perhaps chart out how that is in fact helping us already thinking about ourselves as a political community. One of the most moving slogans and placards during the protests against the CAA was by children and grandchildren of Hindu refugees from Punjab and Bengal, who said, "We are refugees, we are children of refugees. We've seen the worst. We've actually suffered. We've had to move. Overnight, we've lost our homes. We do not want a repeat of that here. Or we understand what that entails for people." So these are children of Punjabi and Bengali refugees. And remember, by the way, this was also around this time when the West Bengal elections took place. A lot of the people voting were refugees from what was earlier East Pakistan and East Bangladesh. Of course, many were, supportive of the CAA and may have voted for the BJP, but we know that lots of them were not. And these are people who have been successively betrayed by the Muslim League, by the Congress, by the communists, perhaps by the Trinamool as well, but that hasn't sort of meant that they've got that ingrained hatred against Muslims. And so I think in that sense, there's a lot that we need to learn from actually people who have suffered the violence of the partition, in whose name the CAA was sort of, brought about. The farmers was another interesting element, because beyond the Khalistani charge, of course, the man who emerges as the sort of, central character after the Republic Day events was Rakesh Tikait. And the Tikaits in Western UP, for those of you who might sort of be familiar with that region, back in 2013, there were ghastly riots between Hindus and Muslims. And it's widely assumed that the Tikaits, even if they're not actively supported the violence, they had kept quiet when they could have intervened to prevent that violence. But what happens after the farmers' movements, and you could say this is opportunistic, but the Tikaits convene a Mahapanchayat in their village, where they invite the Muslim leaders to speak, and a very senior Muslim leader tells them down, says that you were wrong back in 2013, you let your ideas being hijacked by the BJP, what you've done is unforgivable. And there was pin drop silence as all the Jat sort of members of the Mahapanchayat listened. There was no booing, no shouting, but a recognition that there had been a mistake in the past. And the Tikaits said that they were sorry for what happened. And we all know thereafter, across Western UP and Haryana, the farmers from the Mahapanchayats sort of marched towards Delhi. Temples, small little temples that you see across the region, urged farmers to proceed to Delhi in order to support their Chaudhry, as Tikait was called. So in that sense, you do see these moments of solidarity being built up. And I think to answer your question about the roadmap forward, as citizens, one does have to sort of consider the ways in which solidarity could be built throughout times like these. And we have to see the way solidarity is being built even as we speak. So this is not a pipe dream. This is happening before our very eyes. This is happening by people who may not be the sort of, the center of media attention in a positive way, whom the mainstream media might like to portray in specific ways. But these are people who really care for democracy. There's the question of what does it all lead to? And I think one of the things about hope that we have to recognize is hope is not about the consequence of your actions tomorrow. It's about simply acting. And in some ways, I close the book with reference to the Bhagavad Gita and its very famous sort of call where Arjun has sort of goosebumps when he sees the army arrayed against him, and Krishna tells him, well, it's your duty to act. The fruits of action, you don't know what's going to happen, but it's your duty to act. And in some ways, hope is about acting. It's about taking the next step, knowing that there are a whole host of barriers against you, knowing that you may not be successful tomorrow. You may not even be successful the day after tomorrow, but eventually change will come. And change will not come from the heavens. Change will come because of your action today and the action of others around you. Now, I have to also emphasize here, hope is not delusional. It's not about just being suicidal in what you do. You know that there's a problem. You navigate your way through. So hope is not about sort of just doing things for the sake of doing it. It's about being realistic. It's about recognizing who your allies are, who your opponents are, who you can sort of count on, those who are sort of middle of the road, who will only support you when it's convenient to them and abandon you when it's not. So hope involves a lot of calculations. It's not an abstract somewhere that's sort of going on. But the way in which we sort of have to think about hope is people recognizing those alliances, those coalitions. All of us in this room recognizing those coalitions, recognizing that a lot of the problems sometimes may lie within us or in people very dear to us. And what do you do with them? Because obviously we cannot talk about splitting families and sort of calling each other fascists, but it's about working with people you may know have certain views, and that's what you do. You live together and you work together. So that's what a democracy is, and that's what citizenship is about. And you hope, not in terms of hoping for, but you hope to, as in you take steps, you take the next step. And you take the next step recognizing the problems that you're up against, and work with allies, build solidarities. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of building solidarities or alliances, if you will, because it's difficult to fight a lonely battle. And hopelessness is often about pushing people to just thinking about themselves as individuals, and that's something that rulers do all the time. They're winning if they make you feel hopeless. Unfortunately, we are in a state today where hopelessness is a luxury we cannot afford. So we have no option but to hope, and hope in terms of taking the next step, not waiting for deliverance, but taking the next step.
In my bag, you'll find a copy of the professor's book, Audacious Hope. You'll find it heavily annotated. There's probably more writing and more pencil marks than there was when you wrote it. The point I'm trying to make is that I follow politics intensely, but this still taught me a lot. And it's a book that you guys need to pick up right there. Get the professor to autograph it, by the way. There's one line from that Rebecca Solnit essay that I keep going back to. And there's a book of essays by Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark. And there's this point that she makes. Actually, 2 points. One, she says that it's very important when talking about this to define what hope is not. Hope is not the expectation of a result. Hope is merely the awareness of injustice and the determination to do something about it. The other point she makes is that every protest, every single voice that is raised against injustice shifts the balance a little bit. Does it shift it enough to make that difference? Probably not, as you pointed out, probably not today, not tomorrow, not even this generation. But the point that Solnit makes is that sometimes what happens today reverberates over generations and creates change way down the line. So it's part of a continuum. I thought that was what you said last about, the necessity for hope and the necessity for solidarity. It's a good segue to turn this over to the audience. Yeah? Questions, people?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I commend you for the courage in writing a book like this, not worrying about the freedom after speech. I just want to take you back to 1975 and with a thought experiment, where a frog is thrown into hot water, it will jump out. Its instincts, its reflexes are all intact. That's what happened in 1975. A lot of people were jailed. Many went underground. There was a brewing resistance, and ultimately it culminated in 1977. Modi 2.0, what is happening is a very creeping takeover of institutions, processes. The institution of even parliament. Only 55 days was the last parliament, 17th parliament which met. 55 days. I mean, the last year I'm talking about. So with this kind of a takeover, I'm wondering whether it is just audacious hope or is it a pious hope? Is there any data to back that to keep hope? I agree, we have to be optimistic. But is there any data to support that hope ultimately results in action, though it may not be tomorrow or day after? Thank you.
Yes. Do you want me to answer that? Or do you want to take a few questions? Yes, yes. No, of course, that's a very valid concern that we are in a situation where, as you say, it's a creeping sort of problem, and we may not, before we know it, we'll be sort of engulfed. But clearly, we know that there is a creeping problem. The protests that you see around, the sorts of ways in which people are taking a stand, I think that's the data. There may not be quantitative data, of course, in terms of the number of riots that have happened in a country, because what is a riot? What's the data? Who's collecting the data? What does the Home Ministry consider a riot? There are problems with the data. As far as I'm concerned, my data is the archive of what's going on with people now. The fact that there are people speaking up, the fact that you ask a question that you do despite knowing, that there are problems, the fact that there are, and I don't want to overplay the cliche of 1,000,000 mutinies, but there are people who are aware of what's going on and are willing to think about it. I think far too often we equate hope, we equate the action with its consequences. And what I want to do here is to, along with the numerous people who have taken a stand in the past, dealing the two. Of course, consequences are important, but they have still taken the action even when they know that the consequences may not be what they would like the next day. But there is the assertion of certain claims which are just as important as the consequences. So there will not be quantitative data, perhaps, but there is the archive, before us. And some of it is in this book. Obviously, it's not comprehensive by any standards, but you find this across the board in India. I mean, if anything, it's a cornucopia of protests that you find in India. I'm not romanticizing the protests. It would be a nice thing if people didn't have to protest. It would probably be a nice thing if people sat in their, classroom, if students sat in their classrooms and, did what, everyone would like them to do. Or maybe not, I don't know. But the point is that, there is a problem and people are taking a stand. And I think that, as far as I'm concerned, that's my data.
And I'd only add one thing to it, sir. I agree with that first part, that 77 took us by surprise. I agree with it literally because one day after that I found myself in a police station for no fault of mine. But it's also worth remembering that the protests we are talking about what we do today might end up showing results years or generations down the line. But do remember that the farm laws were repealed by probably the most arrogant, adamant government we've ever had. Also remember that for all the bluster, they still haven't framed the CAA rules. The Home Minister today said that the CAA will be implemented, but for the last 5 years he's been asking for time to implement, to actually frame the rules. Clearly what they're doing is they don't want to step away from the CAA, neither do they want to implement it. So it's not like every protest just ends in, yeah, things happen. And this despite the fact that COVID came and interrupted the anti-CAA protests. So I think the hope is contagious.
Okay, yeah. You were trying to locate hope in the student movements, but are these movements that we've seen in the recent past, are they truly like the ones from history, from the distant past? And I'd like to use P. Sainath's words here, where he said recently that, the idealism is kindled in student days in university, and one of the reasons why we are where we are here today is largely because that idealism fades away when life hits you after you get out of college, and that is more stark these days. So when you try to place hope in these movements, and is there really hope is the question again, because these student movements don't seem to be like the ones that we've seen in the past.
Absolutely. You're quite right. You're spot on that the student movements of today are not like the student movements of the past. And probably that's because the world today is not the world of the past, right? I think one of the things we have to recognize about hope is that it's forward-looking. It learns from the past, but it is really about working with what you have now rather than what you would like to have based on the past. And our forefathers or people in the past, you know, with those grand student movements, when they went out on the barricades, they were facing a very different government. They were facing a government, as was said earlier, for instance, which, you know, which formally suspended the constitution. What do you do when the state or those in power have redefined the ways in which they would exert control? And I think it would be foolish to react in the way that people did in the 1970s, because the situation today, as was just said, is very different. There is often the tendency and the temptation to be nostalgic about previous student movements or previous movements of any kind. You know, back in the day, there used to be X, you hear people say, and this is with due respect to everyone who might say that. I can completely see where that's coming from, but the reality today is very different. The reality today is of a much more differentiated, dispersed form of exerting authority. Because, of course, the rulers also learn from the past. They're not stupid, and neither should we be. So, while it is absolutely fine to remember the past, it's absolutely all right to be nostalgic about the past, we work with what we've got. And the past is a good indicator to realize what happened. To remember is to resist, but also you have to remember, you know, that it's not the same situation back in the day. Hope is therefore about recognizing that the past is gone. You work with what you have here and now. I mentioned earlier about hope being realistic, about hope being worldly. It's about, and I repeat, what you have right now rather than what you would like to have had back in the whenever, because that world is not there. For good or for bad, it's not there.
I'd add one thing that might provide some context. Even in the emergency, it was a student movement that started the backlash against Indira Gandhi. The Sampurna Kranti that started in Bihar, for instance. Jayaprakash Narayan then came over and gave it direction and shape. But the more relevant point is, you said, once you leave college, quotidian pressures of existence take over and you're no longer able to be activist. But here's the thing though, Kanaya Kumar left college. I mean, today he's a political activist, that's a different story, but a student leader left college. Aisha Ghosh replaced him. So there are generations of students. The students, the politically active student doesn't end simply because a particular batch graduates. The next one takes over. So hopefully. Using this word, I've got to stop.
Which one? Hopefully.
So my question is regarding federalism in the light of democracy, like where the federalism stands in between the idea of democracy in India. One question is that, and one more question which I have is, so the textbook which I studied had a new social movements sort of things. So that also creates idea of like citizenship, which is like much more caring towards others. And those kind of intervention which is like curtailing these kind of ideas, how that impact this idea of hope?
Yeah. So the question of federalism is easy to answer. Of course, you would expect federalism to act as a bulwark against central overreach. And in some way, I think the point I made earlier about, you know, the emergence of the regional parties since the 1980s means that the situation today is very different from the situation, you know, that Nehru and Mrs. Gandhi faced, for instance. The sort of total control that you may have seen back then, you know, from top down, you know, the Congress party ruled everything, is simply not, doesn't exist today. But that does not mean that some of the regional parties are, exemplars of democracy either. Some of them are also quite taken into dictatorial tendencies. In fact, sometimes the fiercest opponents of Mr. Modi are themselves quite sort of autocratic in their behavior towards political opponents. So, I think in that respect, again, I would like to go, to think about democracy as beyond institutions alone, because the institutions are important, but there's a limit to what the institutions can and cannot do. And a lot of the citizens' actions that you see against the central government are often turned against the state governments as well, precisely because the state government leaders are no angels. Your second question about citizenship and solidarity, and the whole sort of the question of how we should care for each other. I think this has been central to thinking about citizenship for quite some time. Labor movements in the past, student movements, of course, they all had their own specific demands, but they were also talking about a different kind of society. They were also having an idea of social change. They were forward-looking. So I would sort of say that thinking about citizenship is quite a central element to many of the protests that we are seeing, to many of the movements that we are seeing. Whether you call them new social movements or old social movements is not interesting to me. What is interesting is that this is their claim here and now. This is what they are doing. And some, as you've said, have succeeded, some not so, and some have clearly not succeeded. But I think the fact that such claims have been made, I think, interesting to me. And that itself changes the narrative, the political narrative, somewhat.
I think I've spent a lot of too much time with Professor Roy, because I keep looking for where I was looking for all the things that were going wrong. I'm now looking for all the things that are going right. And as you were speaking, I was suddenly remembering that it's just 24 hours, 48 hours, I think, since the dock workers union across the country refused to load weapons bound for Israel. I mean, you're talking of solidarity. This is not even solidarity of the students with the farmers or whatever. This is some country somewhere, and these are people who actually depend on their work for their daily wages. But they're still willing to give that up for a larger cause. So maybe there is hope.
There is always hope. Well, I wouldn't say there's always hope. It's politically created, and I think it's that political action that we need to recognize, absolutely. And that's where the idea of solidarity is so important, not only within the nation, but clearly in this example, beyond the nation as well. Yeah.
Two questions. First of all, thanks a lot. It's been a really engaging and fascinating conversation. My first question is, Professor, I would like to, just curious to know as to what drove you to write this book. Okay. The second, more than a question, I just wanted to put forward something. I happened to meet a couple of PhD students from Delhi who had been arrested during the CA protest out on bail. And they told me three things. They said earlier, cops used to hesitate to come inside the campus. Now that is happening with impunity. Second, the VCs, etc., used to support the students when such things happen. Now the VCs are belonging to the government, so we won't get any support from them. Third, as Prem, you said, you could be taken to the station, but you're out soon. Now you're in for a very long time. And the sort of gloomy prediction that they made was that the next time something happens, students would be a little reluctant to come out because they're aware of the ruthlessness and there is fear.
No, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, obviously, I think those who've gone through this sort of brutality that you mentioned would be very wary of, stepping up action again. But I think to go back to the point you were mentioning, that there are, newer generations or different generations who would do things differently. And I think that goes back to the point that was made earlier, because now that you see what the state or what those in power are capable of doing, or the way they've extended their apparatus, if you will, people are not fools. But that doesn't mean they'll just keep quiet either. There would be other ways of doing things, of asserting your views. I don't know if you've seen this stand-up comedian recently who's talked about how a mall was discovered, or there was a new mall that has been sort of come into being in a country that has hundreds of malls. There's another mall, and then a mall was discovered under the mall. Now, of course, everyone knows what they're talking about, but no one knows what they're talking about. So I'm not romanticizing those ways of sort of, putting one's ideas, but, power is never unchallenged. There are always cracks, especially in a democracy or in even a formal democracy, there's always ways, and in a society which has tasted what democracy is like, which knows what democracy is like, which has battled autocratic powers earlier and won, it's difficult to sort of, clamp them down totally. Because if one theater sort of, closes, another opens, as it were. Thank you. Yes, what drove me to write the book? Well, I think madness, perhaps. No, I'm a political scientist. I shouldn't say I'm a political scientist. I work in a politics department. I teach politics. And, we talk about democracy. We talk about the ways in which democracy is presently being undermined across the world. But I was struck by the very real ways in which people were actually taking steps to prevent their democracy from being undermined. I teach about the politics of India to students who are not Indian. And one of the things I'm always struck with, how India was such an unlikely democracy. When India became democratic in 1952, when it had its first elections, nobody either in the West or anywhere else in the world expected India to survive, much less survive as a democracy. When the 1967 elections took place, for instance, people were writing obituaries to India as a democracy because they said now there's going to be no India because the Congress party had lost power in states. But as a student of politics, I see the ways in which India not only survived but also thrived as a democracy, especially after the 1980s. Warts and all, there were sort of social movements, there were, different ways in which regional parties were sort of, giving voice to regional elements. And you could sort of have questions with some of their specific claims. But the fact is that this was a democracy which was recognizing its entire sort of menu of diversity that existed. A lot of which is, sort of coming under threat, but that threat has not gone unchallenged. And I found that very, very inspiring. And I thought it's useful to write a book which would be read by more than the 3 political scientists who usually attend a seminar. So hopefully more people will read this book.
Talking of more people reading it and mapping it to what Professor Roy was talking about, the video, the mall. One of the things you will find in this, particularly in the last chapters, there's a lot of reference to art as happens in protests. And in multiple places, you'll find little QR codes, which actually take you to the source material, to the YouTube video, whatever it is. And I swear I'm not being paid to say any of this.
Hi. Yeah, I had a question, which is kind of a disagreement. You said that filing a case under the SC/ST Atrocities Act is an act of hope, but I think I would characterize it as an act of assertion, because it is not. People know, of course, that the odds are stacked against them, but by asserting themselves and getting to that point on their own, like just the act of filing a case is an act of assertion. So the question related to this is, given the very long history and of assertion of caste, of assertion of their own rights of equality, which predates independence, given all of that, why do you place a turning point at the Great Chamar?
Excellent question. So the way I think about hope is, inspired a great deal by the works of people like Paulo Freire and bell hooks, who would tell us that hope is about taking the next step when the odds are stacked up against you, as you said. And I think their way of understanding hope comes very close to what you said about assertions, about pushing forward claims. The Great Chamar is merely one example that I give here, by the way. The turning point, as you will see, if you see in this work, is really the Meenakshipuram conversions in 1981, when 300 members of the Dalit community in Tamil Nadu converted to Islam. And that's where, and I'm not saying that's hope necessarily, but that sparks off a sort of counter protest, a counter among the dominant groups in India. And that's, in that chapter, I'm sort of looking at the rise of the BJP and the way in which it sort of becomes the dominant party in the 1980s. So the Great Chamar incident comes much later, of course. And you're absolutely right. It comes much later in a series of protests that arguably go back to the conflict between Brahmanism and Buddhism 2,500 years ago. So I wouldn't disagree with anything you've said.
Yeah, because
Absolutely.
I think like even 1981 is a kind of artificial turning point because that erases the really long history of assertion that has existed. Like just the fact of the Constitution itself is an assertion of this kind of anti-caste politics.
Excellent point. I think the reason I took 1981 was because of the consolidated action against what happened in 1981. When the Constitution came into being, you did have political parties like the Ram Rajya Parishad, for example, sundry other Hindu conservatives who were sort of doing things, but nobody really took them seriously. What you see after 1981, and that's something that I document here, is the way in which you have something called a Virat Hindu Sammelan, which was organized at the Boat Club, where the organizers said, not since the Battle of Kurukshetra have so many Hindus gathered at one place. Jagjeevan Ram, who was then a minister in the Congress government, shot off a letter to the organizers of the Virat Hindu Sammelan. How come you're protesting when 300 Muslims have converted? Why do you not protest when Dalits, or Harijans as he called them, are being routinely discriminated? And the Virat Hindu Sammelan, of course, didn't answer him, but they went right ahead with their boat club sort of organization. You also see that very year that ex-congressman called Daud Dayal Khanna sort of steps up this demand along with the Virat Hindu Sammelan, how you must reclaim the 3 holy Hindu sites. So, and of course we know what the 3 holy Hindu sites are. So the reason I go to 1981 is there are very clearly documented pushbacks that you can see, the likes of which you don't see in the 1950s, because you do have the Constitution, but by and large, political parties fall in line. And you have sundry groups, like I said, who disagree, but no one takes them seriously. What you have in the 1980s, is this constant sort of tug of war. Then after the Virat Hindu Sammelan, the Bahujan Samaj Party is set up. And then in the book, I talk about the Gujarat sort of extension of affirmative action in 1985, which sparks a blowback against reservation. And the riots in Ahmedabad sort of totally took the government and the country by storm. This is the same Gujarat, of course, where today you cannot imagine the Congress party back in power. And so this back and forth continues throughout the 1980s. And when VP Singh sort of announces the affirmative action programs for the OBCs, it just blows up, and we know the sort of story. I link this with the way in which the BJP's vote share continues to rise, and not just the seats, the famous from 2 to whatever 120, but the vote share between in 1989 the BJP has a vote share of 11%. In 1991, that is after the affirmative action sort of the Mandal Commission reservations, the vote share shoots up to 20%. Now that's huge. In the previous decade, 2 seats, but their vote share was, near about 7-8%. But from 11 to 20%, you see almost a double. And then that continues. So the reason for going to, sorry for this extended explanation, but it's a very important question, because the reason I go back to the events of the 80s is because there was an enormous social churn in India, which was happening in the context of elections and democracy. And the fact that, for the first time, the dominant caste Hindus were realizing that they were actually a dominant minority in this country. And that, of course, sparks off the kinds of pushback that you didn't see when the Constitution was created because, as I said, by and large, there was consensus among the centrists and the leftists that this is all right. We can work with it, or we'll undermine it, but we can sort of work with it. You couldn't do that in the events of the 1980s. Thank you. Thank you for asking that question.
Hello, Professor. My question is sort of something that returns to what Mr. Banekar had asked you about. And the point that I make is something that I imagine you're already aware of, where during the Babri Masjid demolition, when we look at newspaper archives, journalists were documenting it up to almost 30 minutes prior to the demolition itself. And newspapers tell us that there were constant calls made to the police and armed constabulary, meaning that the central government had the power to stop this, even up till the last minute. And so I suppose my question to you was about why refer to the 6th of December as oppositional when we know that certain actions by the center constitute nearly as inaction in such a situation constitutes as action.
Before you take that, there's a slight fallacy about that particular period, and I'm saying that as an editor who sat in a newsroom orchestrating or helping to orchestrate the coverage. The calls for central assistance were made about, like you said, actually less than about 15-20 minutes before, so some of the people had already started climbing, and that is when this call was made. There was no way that central assistance could have reached that place.
By 30 minutes, I meant that as though, this is what the archivist place said, that 30 minutes was the last call. That 30 minutes was the last call, but it had started like 2 hours before, 1 hour before 30 minutes.
The problem with Ayodhya during that time was that once the crowds came in, and these were massive, we only see those 20 people who climbed up on the mosque, but that entire area was surrounded by people who had come in from outside, all part of the Kar Seva. You have to remember that at that time, at least, governments went or didn't feel empowered enough to send in troops and say, break heads. You couldn't have done that.
And they tried to do that 2 years ago. Mulayam Singh Yadav sent in troops that resulted in
and
bloodshed.
As trivia, the person who signed the order for shoot at sight under Mulayam Singh's government is one Mr. Nrupendra Mishra, who is now the person in charge of the construction of the Ayodhya temple. But that aside. He was also in the PMO before this.
I think that's an excellent point that has been, and that just points to the complicity of the state. But I think what's interesting for me is the narrative around it. Once the event happened, once the mosque was sort of demolished, you did have a semblance of, people showing they were ashamed. Somebody like the BJP Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh took moral responsibility and stepped down. I'm not saying that you're right about, of course, the entire orchestration, but that's very different from what you see where the head of the government is actively presiding over a specific sort of religious ritual. I wouldn't disagree with what you've said, but I do think narratives matter. I do think what you show matters politically, and that way you do see a break between 6th December and 5th August. And that's the reason I would sort of stick to and say that what you see, something very fundamental changed, something much more profound changed after the 5th of August in 2020.
I just have a question and a comment. I'm at the back. After being here for 4 decades between hope and despair in this country, with various changes and movements, and I just would like to look at this as a social democracy. And in the social democracy, the whole link of aspirational identity to change. And if hope is linked up with change, then it makes a lot of difference. It makes a lot of difference in thinking. And the fact that the way I look at it is generationally, there has been a kind of development according to the kind of aspirations that have been built up. Some have been also successful, some have been generated. just taking a leaf out of The Scavenger's Son, the book by Tagari. And it so beautifully brings out the fact that, so then you can still believe in hope, you can continue to hope, because you're sure that generational wise, the identity that is being asserted, not asserted, and then again asserted to the point of following the upper caste, asserted to the point of being one with the upper caste, therefore you project your identity as such. So that itself, the fact that this is happening, the fact that one can recognize that there is this generational identity change and aspirational changes that are taking place, I think we can continue to live with hope. If we do not recognize that, then there's a block. Then there is a block to saying that nothing can happen. I mean, anyway, everything is despairing. The second point is that, whereas related to archiving, I mean, archiving in the sense of not the very big official archiving, but in Bombay, when the Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid was broken and then the riots took place, the instances of harmony and solidarity, 32 slums did not burn in Bombay because of the fact that the communities there, Hindu majority slums, Muslim majority slums, they all got together within their own communities. They allowed no one from outside to come in, whether it be the army, the government, or anyone. They did not allow anyone to come in. And this was a fantastic show of what people can do when they have hope. And they have to have hope because they have to survive. So therefore, they continued to do this, and 32 slums did not burn because of this. This was not reported at all in the media, definitely. So we have to start archiving. We brought it out in our little booklet at that time. But we have to start archiving all these kinds of hopeful and very, very inspiring kind of stories of ordinary people, of people who are battling it every day without giving up.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that I think that's so important to think about hope related to change, with, of course, the caveat that hope is also disappointable. So because you take action doesn't mean, and that goes back to the conversation we've had, that the consequences will be exactly what you expected. But that does bring us back to the central argument of the book, that people are taking action. People are doing things despite enormous obstacles, as you put it. And I think we do have to prevent romanticizing those struggles. And I think that's sometimes the tendency with a lot of the aspiration sort of oriented work. You know, it's like these are great people, or they have a culture of syncretism and all of that. I mean, we've seen how cultures that were extremely syncretic collapse overnight. Punjab 1947 is an excellent example. You know, there's usually this thing about how Bengal was more syncretic and Punjab less so, and that's rubbish. What works is the political sort of organization, and what you saw in Punjab in 1947 was the political organization had just polarized and collapsed. And I think the examples that you give, for instance, show how these sorts of solidarities didn't just come from the heavens. People were actively working together politically to ensure that those slums or those communities did not burn or did not, rip apart. They themselves, yes. I mean, that's also an act of politics, right? When your entire neighborhood is burning or there's polarization and you decide that you will not let, outside forces or others sort of tear you apart, I think that's important. That is political as well, right? So I couldn't agree more, with the caveat that we should avoid romanticizing the very real struggles, as you put it, the fact that people were, faced with a great deal of political pressure, and yet they take action.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated how you said that hope is forward-looking, and it's not, we shouldn't romanticize the forms of protest that we've seen in the past. But I just want to go back to one thing you mentioned about how the Modi has no choice now today but to sort of at least seemingly respect certain institutions, electoral results, and kind of adhere to some idea of democracy. But I'm just wondering what to do with this language of, like, I mean, like you said, like Modi is not using the same tactics that his predecessors have, because the rulers are not fools, neither are the people. But like he is changing, he's using different language to change what democracy even is and what we even mean when we talk about democracy. So when we say he's technically adhering to whatever kind of delicate rules of democracy we have, he has shaped that in some conscious way, right? Like he's this, the government is using language of like, the original constitution, which doesn't have the word secular socialist in it. Like they're using this language of how, the construction of the temple was constitutional according to the Supreme Court. Like this like legal, historically accurate constitution, like this language is all kind of very palatable to our ideals of democracy. But what's actually happening, I don't know, I'm wondering what to do with this, like, this reframing of what we would think of as undemocratic as actually, and I'm wondering who the people who you mentioned who say like, what erosion of democratic rights, what do you mean? Like how do you counter an argument like that?
Yeah, I think that really is a useful sort of point to think about how democracy is understood or not. And there's a lot of talk, of course, about how India is the mother of all democracies, for instance, and how democracy finds root in India and has flourished in India, and of course the sort of ways in which the constitution itself has been appropriated or interpreted. But I think that's also an opportunity in a way to think about democracy beyond these institutional checks and balances. Those are important, of course, but this country itself shows how protest has been a significant integral part of its history. And when we think about democracy, we often think about elections, institutional checks and balances. But I think what we forget is that democracy is not just the majority rule. It's about working with majorities and minorities, no matter how they are constructed. And I see the difficulty, because the way in which the government would like us, the government would like us to believe that democracy is all sort of, it's all hunky-dory, whereas that clearly isn't the case. And I think that's where those who are dissenting have such an important role, because they remind us day in and day out that democracy is not just about holding regular elections. It's not just about, instituting the federal sort of setup or, having those different institutions being separate. It's about how people sort of step out when they feel their democratic institutions, their democratic rights are eroded. It is unfortunately a constant sort of conversation, if not a battle, to fight. And I'm not calling for anyone to take up arms here. What I'm suggesting is that you do have to sort of work together with what you have. And the way in which the official sort of understandings of democracy are being limited or are being rephrased as if there was an Indian way to do democracy, I think can be sufficiently countered within the liberal tradition of saying, hold on, there are certain things, certain definitions of a democracy, certain things that make a country democratic and certain things that do not. And there are Indic ways also of challenging the same idea, which is to say, well, democracy is about vibrant protest. It's about the centuries of protest that we've had. It's about the ways in which people have pushed back against empires, whether they are Mughal or Maurya or British or whatever else. And that is integral to democracy. So anyone who tries to sort of overreach into social sort of spaces will face a pushback. So there have to be several ways in which this is to be countered. And where I find, to come back to the point that was asked earlier about what motivated me to write this book, I find those ways of rethinking democracy already in existence. It's not something that is being called for, but they're already in existence. The students, the anti-caste protesters, those who were protesting the Citizenship Amendment Act, they're already telling us what an alternative way of doing democracy is in such difficult circumstances. So I completely get and I mean, I respect the frustration of working with a structure of power that seeks to redefine democracy. But like was said, we work with what we've got, and you've got to push back against those ideas that exist here and now, not what existed in the past. We sadly can't choose, those we are sort of politically in an adversarial relationship with. That's what exists, and you've got to sort of work with that. So it's an incomplete answer to your question, but that's the best I could come up with. But thank you for that question.
Couple of things to add. You made the point about the preamble, the original preamble to the Constitution, but did you see what happened immediately after that? The Kerala government announced that the preamble to the Constitution will be taught in every single class in every single government school. Karnataka immediately followed, yes. So that is one point, and map it to another one. At the peak of the BJP's, and this is not a political speech, I'm not going to ask you to vote for XYZ, but the 2019 election was supposed to be the peak. I know that is bar 400 bar or whatever, but never mind that. How many people voted for the BJP? 6 out of 10 people did not. So for all the posturing, for all that has happened in the last 10 years, and even if you go back to 1991, 92, all of that, you still haven't got a majority of the country on the side of illiberalism. So again, there's hope. I'm going to keep doing this.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Professor Roy.